Welcome to Newcastle Family History Society podcast. The Newcastle Family History Society, located on the Wabakal land in Newcastle, New South Wales, Australia, provides support for those interested in family history. And welcome to Becoming Australian, a short series exploring one family's journey from rural England to the emerging communities of New South Wales. Through surviving records, letters, and the traces left in early colonial towns, this story follows the Bakers, a family whose path mirrors the experiences of many early settlers. In this episode, Society member Sandra Boyd uncovers the beginnings of that journey, the choices, challenges, and chance connections that set their migration in motion.
When I first began researching my family tree, my father handed me the original birth certificate of his grandmother, Constance Martha Taylor. It was a little worse for wear, but considering it was dated 1862, that was to be expected. I found the most intriguing parts of the certificate were the details for Constance's mother, Martha Susanna, formerly Baker, aged 18, which meant that she was born in 1843, with her birthplace listed as Dalwood, which I knew to be here in the Hunter Valley, New South Wales. It is this document which inspired me to further research the Baker family, to find out why Martha had been born at Dalwood, to investigate who her parents were and determine where they had come from. Unfortunately, our family has few records and little oral history which could help me in my research. However, by using official records, old newspapers, and importantly, the letters and diaries of others, I've been able to piece together their story. It has become not only a story of European migration, but a story of how my family became an integral part of Australian society. The story begins in the village of Dinton, Wiltshire, in the early 1800s. It is here that Martha's father, Benjamin Baker, was born. The Anglican records of St Mary's Church, Dinton, record the baptism of Benjamin in 1816. He is the son of Henry Baker, a gardener, and his wife Sarah Saunders. Benjamin was one of 11 children born to Henry and Sarah. The youngest in the family, Thomas, was baptised on May 7, 1829, which is the same day that their father Henry was laid to rest in the St Mary's Church graveyard. Now, one of the main landowners in Dinton and surrounds in the 18th and 19th centuries were the Wyndhams. In the early 1800s, William Wyndham was the head of this family. Members of the Baker family appear to have been in the employ of the Wyndhams on the Dinton Park estate, with the farm account books showing various members of the Baker family being paid for their labour and buying farm produce. As agricultural labourers, their duties included mowing oats, hoeing wheat, turnips, mangel, wurzel and rape, tree cutting and rabbit catching. Although members of the Baker family were agricultural labourers, Benjamin Baker was a gardener like his father before him. Benjamin's brother William remained in Dinton and continued the family tradition of working as a gardener. There is more proof of the employment of members of the Baker family by the Wyndhams in the inquest held in 1843 into the unfortunate death of Benjamin's brother David, a stable boy in the service of Mr. Wyndham, who was found drowned in a pond in that gentleman's park on the preceding day. 1840 saw many changes for Benjamin and his new wife Elizabeth Howe. Elizabeth was the daughter of Samuel Howe of the nearby village of Tisbury and his wife Susanna Bader. Samuel is variously described as a thatcher and a dairyman. Benjamin and Elizabeth were married in Tisbury on February 6, 1840, and it appears that plans for their future were already being made. To many in the Hunter Valley, the Wyndham name is a well-known name in the wine industry. William Wyndham's son, George, had emigrated to Australia in 1827 with his wife, Margaret J., and purchased Dalwood in the Hunter Valley in 1828. Ben and Elizabeth would soon be leaving Dinton with the help of George Wyndham and beginning their new life in a new land. The Wyndham family in England were well known for breeding quality livestock, and this tradition continued in Australia. For the purpose of improving his breeding stock, George Wyndham arranged for the import of 6 bulls to New South Wales, 2 Hereford and 4 Devon. The New South Wales State Archives show that on the 19th of May 1840, which was only 3 months after Ben and Elizabeth's marriage, George Wyndham entered into an agreement to bring Ben and Elizabeth to Darwood as bounty immigrants. It would be Ben and Elizabeth's task to escort these 6 bulls on the voyage out to Australia. Ben's occupation as a gardener would also be a useful skill in the colony. Some of the Wyndham family correspondence organising this voyage survives and has been transcribed by C.M. Wright in a book titled Extracts Letters from Dinton to Darwood. On the 11th of July 1840, William Wyndham wrote the following letter whilst at the London docks, where Ben and Elizabeth were also preparing to depart. The hustle and bustle of the London docks would have been an amazing sight for this young couple from rural Wiltshire. This letter was written just 1 day prior to the ship Symmetry embarking on its voyage to Australia. My dear George, I send you this by Captain Butler of the ship Symmetry, begging him to forward it to you as soon as he arrives at Sydney. He takes 6 bulls, 2 Herefords and 4 Devons, for you, accompanied by Ben Baker of Dinton and his wife, to whom I have entrusted the care and charge of the bulls, etc., all of which I hope will get safe to your place. As soon as you get this, be so good as to write immediately to the captain, that he may know your wishes regarding these cattle. I have written particulars at great length by Ben Baker, who will deliver them to you when you see him. With my kindest regards to you, Margaret, and all your young people, I am, my dear George, your affectionate father, William Wyndham. And there's a postscript. I understand since I have been here that the bulls are the first things that will be landed on their arrival at Sydney. Captain Butler has promised to look to the cattle himself in case of Baker's seasickness, so I have promised that the sailors who assist upon such an occasion should receive a trifling reward on the cattle arriving safely. There is another letter dated August 1840 in which George Wyndham's Aunt Ella wrote to him and detailed that the bulls were accompanied by Benjamin Baker and wife, 3rd son of Henry and grandson of old William Baker, who had many injunctions from his friends to stick to Mr. George, and then, as I was told, he will stick to thee. Thus we have the exact advice given to Ben Baker by his friends prior to setting sail for Australia. The voyage was long and no doubt arduous, taking 5 months and arriving in Sydney in December 1840. Aside from one other, the Bakers were the only passengers on what was essentially a supply ship. The assisted immigrant passenger lists record that Benjamin was a gardener and Elizabeth a dairymaid. They were both Protestant and could both read and write. They were of good health. Upon their arrival, Ben and Elizabeth both complained of general ill treatment on the voyage. It may be that the sailors were concerned that they would not receive their trifling reward if they were not required to help look after the bulls, but that's something we will never know. Fortunately, the bulls fared a little better than the Bakers, with the Australian reporting on Saturday, December the 12th, that 6 splendid bulls have arrived by the Symmetry in excellent condition for Mr. George Wyndham of Hunter's River. In the book Hereford History, A.J. McConnell records that one of the Herefords was named Baker after the herdsman in charge, and this bull is the ancestor of many Herefords subsequently bred in Australia. After their arrival in Sydney, Ben and Elizabeth travelled to Darwood, George Wyndham's estate in the Hunter Valley, where Ben's expertise as a gardener would have been very useful. By 1840, George Wyndham had over 1,100 fruit trees planted, along with 75 varieties of grapes. He was also growing countless varieties of vegetables, which were grown both experimentally and to feed all those who worked at Dalwood. Ben and Elizabeth's eldest daughter Sarah was born at Dalwood in 1841. Sarah's baptism record from the Anglican parish records for St Mary's, West Maitland, states that Benjamin was a gardener. When Ben and Elizabeth's second daughter Martha, my great-great-grandmother, was baptised at St Mary's, West Maitland in 1843, Ben was listed as a storekeeper of Dalwood. This was an important position at Dalwood, controlling stock inventory for goods brought to the estate and protecting that stock from both pests and thieves. It also suggests that Ben had a reasonable degree of literacy, as record keeping was a key part of being a storekeeper. The 1840s brought drought to New South Wales, and the Wyndhams moved north with their stock. By 1845, Dalwood was being advertised for lease. It was a property containing between 3,000 and 4,000 acres, with a stone house, stores, offices, etc., and a good garden. A vineyard of 5 acres could be taken with a lease. In 1846, German vine dresser Jacob Scheib was producing and selling wine at Dalwood. With the Wyndhams no longer at Dalwood, it's possible that the Bakers either made the decision to leave and pursue other opportunities or were required to go. In any event, by the mid to late 1840s, Ben and Elizabeth, with their daughters Sarah and Martha, had relocated to New Friul near Singleton. Another daughter, Mary Ann, was baptised in 1848 at nearby Whittingham. The Anglican parish records show that Ben at this stage was a carpenter and their abode was in New Friul. New Friul was the home of John Crichton Stewart MacDougall, who had purchased the property in 1844 when the previous owners had become insolvent. It was an area of approximately 2,000 acres located on the Hunter River, approximately 8 miles from Singleton. By the time of his death, some 50 years later, MacDougall had developed the land as a large working estate. He was also an important man in the community, holding positions as magistrate, warden, church warden, to name a few. It is at New Friul that the Bakers met the families of George Gray, stonemason and builder, and Edmund Bull, gardener and labourer. Oral history of the Gray family suggests that George Gray was a stonemason who worked on All Saints Anglican Church, Singleton. The construction of the church had commenced in 1845, but portions were built so poorly that it was partly demolished. Construction recommenced in 1848, which is the year that George Gray arrived at New Friul. Edmund Bull and Ben Baker also worked closely with George Gray, and so it's possible that all three were involved in the construction of the church, which was designed by architect Edmund Blackett, who was to be appointed government architect in 1849. It's important to note that the land in this area had been settled thousands of years before by the Wonnarua people, whose lives were upended by European settlement. In the 1820s, the Upper Hunter had been surveyed and Crown grants were awarded along the Hunter River. By the 1840s, many First Nations people were unable to provide for themselves as their access to rivers and therefore food and water was denied. In the Singleton area, there were camps for First Nations people who often asked settlers in the area for food. My own oral family history records that Elizabeth Baker was sometimes asked for sugar. The memoirs of George Gray's son, George Abner Gray, describe an incident where a Wonnarua man threatened George's family as he felt he'd been teased by the children. With no adult in the house at the time, George's brother and sister ran to Mrs. Baker for help, thus confirming that both the Gray and Baker families were living in close proximity to the Wonnarua people. The Bakers' time at New Friul in the 1840s places them in a position to witness firsthand the devastation caused to the First Nations people by the European settlement of Australia. In the area surrounding MacDougall's New Frew, many of the colony's well-known settlers had been granted or purchased land. This included Henry Dangar, Robert and Helena Scott, James Mitchell, and perhaps the less well-known Charles Simpson. These men were considered to be important men in their local communities and no doubt known to each other. They were variously magistrates, church wardens, and justices of the peace. It is, however, Charles Simpson, local magistrate, who becomes central to the story in the next steps taken by the Baker family as they navigate life in Australia. Residing at Black Creek, only a short distance from New Frew, it seems likely that recommendations for stonemasons, builders and carpenters were sought by Charles Simpson for his upcoming project. In any event, Ben Baker, George Gray and Edmund Bull were to stay together and make a life-changing move to Newcastle. In 1849, Charles Simpson had purchased land which was very close to the town of Newcastle in the present-day suburbs of Mayfield and Waratah. The land was part of the estate previously granted to John Loriot Platt, whose failure to successfully farm this area led to it being named Platt's Folly. By 1851, the Baker, Gray and Bull families had relocated to Newcastle to work on the construction of the house for Charles Simpson. Simpson had accepted a position as warden of the Council of Newcastle. This house was a substantial building on the banks of the Hunter River and the first in the area. Simpson gave it the name Waratah House, as it was believed that the Waratah flower grew no further north than this point. It is from Simpson's house that the suburb of Waratah was to get its name. In my next podcast, I'll take a look at the lives of the Baker family and their neighbours in the early days of settlement in this area of Newcastle.
You've been listening to Becoming Australian, a deep dive into the early lives of the Baker family and the world they stepped into as new arrivals in the colony. In the next episode, Sandra will follow their move toward the growing settlement of Newcastle and discover how their work and relationships shaped the community that followed. Thanks for joining us on Newcastle Family History Society podcast.